So this is a 1980, or actually a 1981 issue of People magazine. It is the 25 most intriguing people of 1980, and this was put out January 5th, 1981. As you can see, the cover has detached, but it's other than that, it's still intact. And on the back of it is an ad for cigarettes, of course, which was very common in the 80s. To find these on magazines, and it did already have the Surgeon General warning at this point. So on the cover, we see Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan, who had just been elected president. Larry Hagman, who was the star of a popular show called Dallas. Sugar Ray Leonard, who was a boxer. Goldie Hawn, the actress. Robert Redford, and Brooke Shields. All of these people arguably were really popular in 1980. So, and then it also says the faces to watch in 1981. So what I'm gonna do is flip through this magazine, and along the way, if it sparks any stories from the 80s, I'll tell you some stories of what it was like growing up through all the years of the 80s. I started school in 1979, so I remember every year of the 80s, and I remember the events. I remember the attitudes, and the styles, the fashions, and so forth. So, on when we open the first page, there's an ad for Small Miracle by Clairol. It's the first conditioner that makes hair so beautiful it stays beautiful even through 3 shampoos. That's their claim. So, there were two types. There was regular and extra body. I don't think this exists anymore, or if it does, it doesn't look like that. And I don't know if this conditioner really did work through 3 shampoos. That's a little bit hard to believe, because I mean, you can wash out a lot of stuff with one shampoo treatment. The next, we have one of these famous Brooke Shields Calvin Klein ads. In the 80s, the Brooke Shields Calvin Klein thing was nothing gets between me and my Calvins. So, and they that was popular and maybe a bit controversial at the time. Brooke Shields was, it seemed like she was always controversial in the 80s, because she was, I guess the idea is that she always seemed too young to be in the sort of things that she was in. So, and I think that is all settled down now. But in the 80s at the time, Brooke Shields was definitely a figure of a lot of controversy. Then we have an ad here for Enterprise Radio, the sports network. This was wow, sports updates every 30 minutes. So this, keep in mind, this was before the internet. This was when we had 3 or 4 channels on TV. This is where we got our news from the newspapers. So a radio that could deliver sports updates like this was probably pretty handy if you were a sports fan, or if you were a betting man or a bookie or something like that. Next, we come to the kind of the intro pages, where it gives you a table of contents, starting with mail, and then they have the big cover article about the most intriguing people. The picks and pans part is like what was good or bad from and I think that it covers the whole year 1980. Then some stuff about Dallas, which was the popular show of the time, a part about losers, the biggest stars who were losers. That might be interesting to look at, to see if any of them ever picked themselves up again. And now we first get to the mail section, and this was once again, the 80s was a different time. There was no Twitter, there was no Facebook or social media, so this was your 15 minutes of fame. If you got your letter published in a magazine, that would be a real claim to fame at this time. So, oh, I have a cat who's decided to join the video. Please don't step on this. It's 40 years old. Okay. Let's let her do her thing real quick. And on the next page, we have an ad for a Pioneer Syscom. This was a big stereo record player, tape deck, graphic equalizer, um, two big speakers. This was what you would have in your living room if you were a swanky person in the 80s. This is your music station. You have, as you can see, there's the headphones, the microphone, the whole setup here. Sirius Hi-Fi made simple. So what I see missing here would be the other tape deck, so you could copy tapes. That's what we all wanted in the 80s. We wanted two tape decks so we could put in a tape and then we could copy it onto a blank tape. Like if you wanted Thriller or something like that of your own without buying the tape, you borrowed your friends and then you would copy it. You also could copy your albums onto tapes, or you could talk into the microphone and you could make little Christmas tapes to send to your family. And believe me, there's a lot of those. Next is one of these ads for Columbia House. Is this? Yeah, there was two big companies. There's Columbia House and BMG, and they did. I think these are 8 tracks. They did tapes, 8 tracks or records, and the deal was is you picked out 10 for 1 cent, and then suddenly these things would come to your mailbox every month, and it was the devil to try to stop it. So so it was a tough thing to get into. Generally, people would get stuck with it, and then they'd end up owing money because they would go on a vacation and they come back and there'd be like 5 shipments of music to them, and then it was just too much of a pain to send it back. So that we would build our music libraries that way. Still has the business reply card here. This could turn into a living nightmare for a lot of people, but they wanted their Anne Murray or Queen or Jackson Browne or the Doobie Brothers. And you can see, I mean, we got the Letterman, Ted Nugent, Ricky Lee Jones, Steve Martin, A Wild and Crazy Guy. That was like a comedy album. That's another thing, is there was comedy albums that was really big back then too. Like Bill Cosby, Brother Dave, I think it was. There was a lot of that. Now we have Picks and Pans. And what they're talking about is let's see. Through actors, authors, rockers, and legislators dine and wine on their notices, the most courageous of them aren't afraid to review each other. So, okay, they're taking celebrities and they're having celebrities talk about other celebrities like Billy D. Williams, Angie Dickinson, Ed McMahon, and athletes and so forth. So that's what that's all about. Barbara Bush, the incoming second lady, praised Thursday's child Victoria Pool's book about her son's heart transplant, and MASH. She panned all soap opera and loud rock and roll. I mean, that's sort of setting up like the personalities of celebrities and so forth. So here we have an ad for Schlitz beer, the great American beer switch. And then it also says watch Schlitz versus Bud live on the AFC playoffs. So they're gonna compare beer. I'm not a beer drinking man really, but I've tasted both of these beers, and I would say that Bud is better than Schlitz. Okay. Next we have more of this Picks and Pans. Billy D. Williams, he liked NBC's Sophia Loren, her own story. Loren is a fantastic lady who overcame tremendous hardship because he's really into economics and politics now. Billy D. picked conservative William Simon's A Time for Truth as top tone and called George Benson's Give Me the Night a superbly listenable album. Williams couldn't bear to pick a worst anything. As far as I'm concerned, everybody's doing their best, he says, just like me. And of course, if you're a Star Wars fan like me, you'll know that Billy D is going to be in the next Star Wars movie, and we're all excited to see him flying the Millennium Falcon one last time. So anyway, the next page is an ad for Buick, and I'm gonna confess to you that I do love car ads and magazines, but I, having grown up being a child through the '80s and everything, '80s cars still don't really do it for me. I mean, this is what I used to see every day. It may be interesting to you, but seeing this Buick Century, I just think of this is just a grandpa car. And I do like how it's juxtaposed over the old Buick from the classier one, but I remember riding the back seat of these all the time with a box of Kleenex, and so it's imagination has just become reality. Fuji cassettes. And I don't know what they're getting at with that, but they do have a picture of what looks like a robot with some computer looking graphics. These are just blank tapes that you would tape and steal your music onto. So before we had the ability to so easily and efficiently steal music off the internet, back then you actually had to put a little elbow grease into it and put a blank cassette in there and rig up a way to tape the cassette you were borrowing from your friend or that you checked out from the library. And let me tell you another thing. Back then, if a tape came out with popular music, the library would stock it, but it would be hard to get the most popular stuff. So, it probably wasn't going to be hard for you to get your hands on a gospel tape or something like that. But if you wanted Michael Jackson, or if you wanted Phil Collins or something like that, it would be a lot harder. So you generally would have to borrow from your friend. More picks and pans. Erica Jong, Nancy Fridays. They're saying that's the worst. Nancy Friday's compendium of male sexual fantasies, men in love, is watered down pornography. Here's an ad for Anacin. More pain reliever. 800 versus 650 milligrams in the other leading brands. So if you had a headache, you would turn to Anacin. Notice the bottle is made out of glass and the lid was not safety protected because this was 2 years before the big cyanide scare. Honda. Here's a car ad for another car that I saw a lot in the 80s, the Honda, and I believe this is the Accord from the 80s, and it looks much different from the much more solid and big Accord that we have now. It was a much more compact car back then. I would think this was a Civic, but this is the Accord. It's an ad for Barton and Goustier wine. For 255 years, we've been keeping good company with wine lovers, and we continue with lots of the picks and pans from the 80s. And now we're getting to the more interesting stuff like the best and worst music and the best and worst movies. So let's kind of look through that real quick. They're saying that this 1980s, the best songs were There and Back by Jeff Beck, Humans by Bruce Cockburn, The Wall by Pink Floyd, Bartok piano concertos, The Pretenders, Trilogy by Frank Sinatra, Argy Bargy by Squeeze. I don't even know what that is. Guilty by Barbra Streisand, The Wanderer by Donna Summer, and Empty Glass by Pete Townsend. And here's the worst. The worst is Keeping the Summer Alive by the Beach Boys, Hold Out by Jackson Browne, Full Moon by the Charlie Daniels Band, All Shook Up by Cheap Trick, But the Little Girls Understand by The Knack, McCartney 2 by Paul McCartney, Monty Python's Contractual Obligation album. That sounds funny. I've never heard of it. Mad Love by Linda Ronstadt, Women and Children First by Van Halen, and Bolero, which was definitely overused in the 80s. Okay, the best of the movies, according to this, was Airplane, and I agree with that. That was a funny movie. Coal Miner's Daughter, and that had Tommy Lee Jones and Sissy Spacek. It was the biography of Loretta Lynn. It played on TV all the time. Just to Kill, I would disagree with that one. I thought That movie was ridiculous. It had Michael Caine and it had Angie Dickinson. The Elephant Man, that was by David Lynch. That was pretty good. The Great Santini with Robert Duvall, it was okay, but I don't think it aged very well. Melvin and Howard. And this is about Howard Hughes. Had Jason Robards, and it had oh gosh, I can't remember her name, but she's the actress in lots and lots of movies. Oh gosh, I wish I could remember her name right now. It'll come to me probably in the middle of this video. My Brilliant Career. I've never even heard of this movie. It's Australian. Ordinary People. Another one that was really well reviewed at the time, but I don't think it aged so well. Raging Bull. A lot of people swear by this movie, and very few people have watched it. And The Tin Drum. That's a German movie that is very artsy and very controversial. So it's even been banned in a few countries. The Worst. Now you're not going to agree with this. This is what people in 1980 said are the worst movies of 1980. The Blues Brothers. A movie that is considered a classic, that is aged incredibly well. Also considered one of the most successful Saturday Night Live movies ever. Can't Stop the Music. Okay, I'm not going to argue with that. Cruising. I don't think that one... I agree that one probably is considered pretty bad. Guyana, Cult of the Damned. That's about Jim Jones, the Jim Jones cult. A cult classic, oddly enough. Now, Heaven's Gate. Widely reviled, expensive Western. A lot of people have been trying to embrace it. I've tried to watch it several times, and I've still never been able to watch it cover to cover. It's just so doggone boring. The Octagon with Chuck Norris. Probably one of his weaker movies. Saturn 3 with Farrah Fawcett and Kirk Douglas. Fun to watch, I have to admit. It's just weird. Somewhere in Time. This is a huge cult classic, and I don't think it belongs on this list. I consider it a beautifully done movie. When Time Ran Out with Paul Newman, and Xanadu, another one that's become a cult classic. So I think their best list and their worst list are pretty questionable. Okay, now the next page is all about Ronald Reagan, the president-elect. A big interview with him on People. So he, growing up in the 80s, Reagan was a constant presence. He was either really, really hated or really, really loved, depending on who you were talking to. That's what I'll tell you about Reagan. More of that interview. Now we have an interview with Goldie Hawn, and the theme of this interview is Private Benjamin, which was a movie she did about joining the army after she becomes a widow, and she's at the time they had a term for princess, which was very she was an affluent girl, and then she joins the army, and then in the army she finds herself. So the movie was kind of like a comedy, but it was also sort of like some subtle recruiting to get women into the army, and it was funny. It made a TV show. I didn't think it was a bad movie. An unemployed electrician becomes a working class hero to Poland in the free world. So here's an article about Lech Walesa, and if you want to Google that and learn the story, but here's a little bit of forgotten 80s history, international history, that you might want to look into. Colonel Charlie Beckwith. Failure has no fathers, only a hero. The Army's rugged hostage rescue commander. And the context of this was there was a hostage crisis that had lasted over a year when President Carter was in office, and they could not get the hostages released until Reagan took office, even though I think the negotiations finally ended under Carter's rule. There was a rescue attempt that went south. It was a messed up time, and there was a lot of tension during this time in the 80s. In the late 70s was a time of a lot of tension with OPEC, the companies against a President Carter who was very much into self sufficiency, using our own oil. So there was a lot of, and he was also trying to cut energy use. He was very forward thinking about how oil reserves were. So, although at the time he was definitely his ideas were rejected a lot. I think now, looking back with hindsight, he was probably his ideas would not be looked at the same way nowadays. If nothing else, genetic engineering can turn a scientist into a multimillionaire, Herbert Boyer. And what we're talking about here, in his lab, Herbert Boyer gingerly shows off a flask of bacteria produced in interferon, the sought-after experimental drug. That's another interesting thing you might want to look into. There's some 80s history that's kind of forgotten. Mary Cunningham, blonde, beautiful, and no longer a Bendix. She's looking for room at the top. Cunningham no longer sees the future through glass darkly. How is she feeling after the crisis with Bendix chairman Bill Agee? If someone can say the word Bendix without my shuddering, then I'll know that normalcy has returned. This is interesting article, especially in the context of the stuff that's been happening the last couple of years with the Me Too movement and so forth. So that's something you might want to consider reading about if you want to Google it. Here, Eric Hyden has 5 gold medals on his chest and Crest to help keep gold out of his teeth. So it's an ad for Crest. Here's another car ad. Ford proudly introduces its 1,204,133rd Fairmont. Ford Fairmont. I don't think they make that model anymore. But that's actually kind of pretty compared to most. I always considered the cars of this time period to be quite boring. I really did. Here's an article about Fidel Castro. He grinned after solving 125,000 problems, but now he faces a new one, Reagan. And Reagan being a right conservative against, they were generally not friendly to communism. So Castro and Reagan were gonna butt heads. A King Khan artist sets up Abscam for the FBI and snares some unsuspecting politicians. Abscan, I remember that. Oh boy, that was that's another thing you need to Google. The FBI recorded the dealings between Representative Michael Myers and Weinberg Laura Wright. The Pennsylvanian was convicted and expelled from Congress. Interesting. Who is the greatest? A tough little man wins the championship and the title. Sugar Ray Leonard. He was really popular in the early 80s. You saw Sugar Ray Leonard everywhere. So if you haven't heard of him, look him up. He was a boxer and a huge celebrity in the early 80s. Here's an ad from Mazzola. 11 naturals for good evening, and it gives you some advice on some vegetables you could eat, like cucumbers and mushrooms and so forth. And it's just a pretty ad. Here's an ad for more filtered cigarettes. I'm more satisfied. More for that extra measure of satisfaction. They seem to be in brown paper. They're 120s, which means they're longer cigarettes, and it was common to see these. Smoking was much more common in the 80s than it is now. They have done now vaping, unfortunately, has just sort of replaced it. I mean, I've understand that vaping's might even be worse, but here's an ad for Ron Rico Extra Dry White Wine, and it shows this couple. They're sailing, and I guess that it's not rum. It's rum. It shows what I know about alcohol. Okay, this is not wine. It's rum, and so the couple sailing, and then they're gonna drink some rum, authentic rum of Puerto Rico. So, the next page is about Robert Redford, and he directed the movie Ordinary People with Mary Tyler Moore and Donald Sutherland. And that was a movie about a family coping with the death of their son. I think that's what it was. It was really widely hailed when it came out. Here was Dr. Tarnower's death an accident or murder? Only the quiet head mistress knows. Jean Harris, a murder mystery that you should read about from the early '80s. Definitely want to read about that. Okay, this is great. And if you go into thrift stores and so forth, you'll find all these wonderful Time Life sets. Like there's the Old West, and they made a set for everything. But this one is a kind of a hard to find one. It's the Seafarers. And this set is all about ships and seafarers. And it was the kind of the same format with the sort of the leather covers with a picture on the front, the gold text, and they all look so good in your shelf, and they're loaded with pictures and stories. And you would generally set sail on the Seafarers with the pirates, yours for 10 days free, so you would get the book to review. Now, we did that when I was a kid. We would get these books and review them and send them back if we didn't like them. So I've really gotten interested in like finding these sets over the years. Like I have a lot of the Old West ones, I have a lot of the Civil War ones, the true crime ones, and there's some supernatural ones I like. I would love to get my hands on these. These books look just fabulous. I really would like to find these, because I do like pirate stuff. So here's another cigarette ad for Benson and Hedges Lights. Hundreds B&H, I like your style. So the couple here has some dogs in the snow, and then they're smoking some cigarettes. Here is about Stephen King. Boy, Stephen King has been one of the most enduring authors that I can think of. My whole life, Stephen King has been writing books and being the basis for popular movies. When I was very, very young, Carrie was a movie around this time. He was doing this Tales from the Crypt. The first Stephen King movie I think I watched. Let me see. I think the first one I watched was the one with Christopher Walken where he could see the future. And then I watched Christine. And as a kid, watching a Stephen King movie was a big deal. They were scary, and you hadn't really seen stuff that scary in movies before. So, some of them, It, when it came on TV, was terribly scary. And then Carrie was just, adults only. That was just The Shining. I didn't even see it until I was a teenager, because, these movies were just considered so, adult. There's Nothing Like People. It's a picture pack weekly that's all about everyone. Check it out. Take home a people just for the fun of it. And it shows you some of the covers from over the years. Lindsay Wagner, Larry Hagman, Yoda, Steve Martin, Robert Redford. Greta Waits, a Swift Norwegian teacher, gives the cold shoulder to the other women runners in the world. Another interesting, if you're sports themed article, you want to Google that. Diplomat's name lives on as a killer volcano. And yes, Mount St. Helens. When that erupted, I was in kindergarten, and I clearly remember when that happened. I lived in Kansas, and it was a big deal. It was all over the news. Ash was falling all over the western side of the country. There were people who died. There were people who refused to leave when it erupted. It was a huge news story. It was shocking that a volcano that big would erupt in the United States. Yeah, there really wasn't anything that big. The biggest news stories that I can remember, like, it was boom this, then it was boom Reagan got shot, then boom the Challenger, were the three big stories that I remember as a kid in the 80s. Jerry Falwell, the moral majority. That was becoming bigger and bigger as the 80s moved on. Pat Benatar, very hugely popular singer in the 80s. Rock finds its missing links. She's doing time in the top 10 for what she calls crimes of passion. Lee Rich, like JR's assailant, the producer behind Dallas aims to please and does. So this is about Dallas, which I don't know if you can even compare a show today that was as popular as Dallas was then. For one reason, you didn't have that many options to watch TV. We didn't have Netflix or Amazon Prime or Hulu or any of that stuff. We were stuck with the 4 channels. So everyone was watching Dallas or MASH or Soap or Dynasty. I mean, we only had the same things to watch, and that's why Dallas. You just can't even express how popular the show was. Everyone in America knew about who shot Jr. And I mean, it just there's nothing like it anymore. Sonia Johnson, in the battle for the ERA, a Mormon feminist waits for the balloon to go up. The ERA, which was Equal Rights Amendment, and you heard ERA all the time at the time because I think at that time equal rights and feminism was there was much more at stake then, and I think that the women who fought for those rights really were like trailblazers, because it's hard to imagine that in 1979 and 1980 there was still so much, like there was much worse than I think today. Watch movies like 9 to 5 and so forth. And the Me Too movement is one thing, but go back to 1970s and the early 80s when women were really truly treated in an unequal manner at the time. It's sad when you consider that they had gone from working in factories during World War II to being shoved back into a house and then kind of treated as second-class citizens for about 40 years. So that's something to think about. Things have changed a whole lot, and the ERA was definitely something you heard a lot about, and you don't hear so much about today. So there was a different kind of a feminism then. So it's interesting to reflect on the differences. Sam Shepard, he just passed away, but he was a big actor, and he was kind of one of the people who was considered to go up far, and I think he's definitely was a respected actor during his life, kind of an everyman. I liked him in a lot of movies. Here's an ad for Bailey's Original Irish Cream. Another car ad, the 81 Chevy Chevette. Oh boy, that car. It looks so much like the Honda Accord, and it looks so much like the so many of the other ones. They all looked alike. Another ad for cigarettes, Triumph. So you got a guy, and he's walking with 2 girls, and they're smoking cigarettes, and they're happy. Now we get to Richard Pryor, who between 1980 and 1983 was incredibly huge. He was making all kinds of... He went from being like an adult comic to being making all kinds of family-friendly movies that we would see in the drive-in. He was a troubled man, and the more time goes on, we find out more about his life, and there was a lot more layers to him than we ever really knew. At the time, it's just like, Richard Pryor's in the movie, and we need to watch it. He was funny. But Eudora Welty, the nation's critics bow before the small-town tales of a masterly Southern writer. And here's another one that sort of lost to time that you might want to Google. The Henry Ford of the Japanese auto industry is known as Pop to his workers. And this is the guy, Soichiro Honda, the guy who founded Honda. So that's definitely something that he's pretty significant nowadays. Beverly Sills, Bubbles from Brooklyn, has stopped singing and begun bossing the company she once graced. Beverly Sills. I used to hear about her a lot too. Not so much anymore. Dan Rather. What, now, at this time, Walter Cronkite was still the voice of America and the most trusted newsman. I still can recall his face and voice when Walter Cronkite was on TV. We all watched and we trusted. Dan Rather was assumed to fill that spot. Here, this ad for Maxell is very famous. That ad just lasted for like 20 years or more. Always saw this picture. Blank tapes. Just turn your music on. Brooke Shields, again, the controversial Brooke Shields. But she was a big deal in the 80s, let me tell you. Whatever happened to an update on some of 1980 news and makers. G. Gordon Liddy, he was involved in Watergate. Someone on Tic Tac Doe, which was a game show. Let's see. Ursula Andress. Mackenzie Phillips. She got kicked off One Day at a Time for being on drugs. I have our autobiography here. It's an interesting read. Mary and Richard Leakey. ABC News Close-Up. A Matter of Survival. Poor can't take no more. Killing, alcohol, suicide, divorce. What leads cops to the breaking point? So this is about cops snapping. And then there's this is about poor people in America. So two topics of interest in the 80s. Let's see. Another car ad for Pontiac Grand Prix. Looks like every other car in the 80s to me. Foster parents. This is want to help save the world. You can do it one child at a time. I think this is the one where you would send money and then they would write letters to you. That was a big thing in the 80s. I don't know if they still do that or not. This is more Dallas stuff. Dallas Fallout. When I was a kid, we went to Fort Worth and ate at the Cattlemen's Club, which was the place where Larry Hagman actually ate when he was in Texas. So that was a big deal. It's a steakhouse. This is about real JRs in Texas. Happy returns to James Bond, chocolate chip cookies, nylons, rock and roll, and the credit card. So these are things that celebrated anniversaries. An ad for Smirnoff vodka in color here. This guy's playing a piano, and these people are enjoying his music, and then they're going to drink some vodka. Another car that's not so bad looking. It's the Capri from Lincoln Mercury, and I kind of like that one. It's a little bit sportier than the other ones. Comtrex relieves more cold symptoms than any of these. It's the one that had all the little tiny pebbles inside of it, the time release thing. I remember the commercials. More anniversaries, credit cards, Blondie cartoons, Diners Club, cameras. Here's a gallery of photographs. I'll show you the ones that I can show you. Some of them are hard to look at. Some of them have a little nudity, so I'm not going to show those. Some of the here's an ad for Irish Spring. There's two types of Irish Spring, green and yellow. That's the exciting new color, Sunshine Yellow. I don't know if they still make it. That's a sad picture of famine. And an ad for Cambridge 100s. Here is 5 fading celebs, and they turned it into a connect the dots puzzle. So they have here Kate Jackson, which is kind of sad because she would go on and not fade so much when Scarecrow Mrs. King came out. I think that's John Travolta. I'm not sure who that is. George Washington for some reason. Muhammad Ali. That's an odd choice. Here's the sports news. Fast cars and strong women. For 6 young athletes, their best is very close to great. Beth Daniel is the next Nancy Lopez in golf. Albert King. Neil Lomax. Travolta plunges, Streisand defers, Nicholson sizzles, and Beau is in search of a swinger. These are movies. Blowout, that was a big flop for John Travolta. A James Bond movie, The Spy Who Loved Me. The terrible, awful Tarzan movie. Here's my Tarzan story. So as a kid, I was young when this Tarzan with Bo Derek came out, and I didn't understand what it was all about. So we were at some store, and there was like Tarzan trading cards, and I saw that, and being a kid, I thought Tarzan was something I was interested in, so I wanted to buy them, and everyone's like, no, you can't have those. I didn't realize that the cards had pictures of the nude Bo Derek all over them, and that was what they were for. I didn't get any of that at the time, so I was upset because I couldn't get the Tarzan trading cards, but there was a reason. Let's see. Height reports on male sex. Miss Piggy takes up Pin and Oink, and Armageddon's back in fashion. John Irving wrote The World According to Garp, which is a pretty sad story. They told me not to drink the water. I think I'm going to need the specialist Kilpectate. Oh boy. While Peter, Hotting, and Jane pray, Farrah rides again. Let's see. Yo Mama. Yo-Yo Ma, not Yo Ma. I'm sorry. Yo-Yo Ma was the cellist. He was very famous. It's so easy to say that wrong. Okay. Ask Lynn Eaton RN if her holiday was a happy one. The House of Seagram. That's... Okay. Perry pushes pants. Betsy is bringing back the mini, but are we ready for the maxi again? We were still, in 1980, we were still pretty much dressing like it was the 70s. Still fixing our hair like it was the 70s. It was still, until about 1983, things were still pretty much like the lame 70s. Let's see. Enter a rock gospeler, the new John Anderson and Stevie Nicks Mac. All they need is Bear. Here's an ad for Bear aspirin. Head Now gives you an additional edge. Tennis racket. The generation they gave us Spock and Rock now faces a brave new cause, midlife. Spock, they're talking about Dr. Spock, the baby doctor. Before What to Expect When You're Expecting, everyone bought the Dr. Spock book. And a lot of people now think it was bad. Lonnie Anderson, she was huge at this time. Audrey Hepburn, Art Buchwald. The Christmas Give Your Favorite People Their Favorite People. It's an ad to get a gift subscription. Early Bird Special, Harley Davidson stuff and gear. Let's see, Dolly Parton, Barbara Walters, Erica Jong, Gloria Swanson, military brats. And they're showing actors who were children of military people. Interesting article. Priscilla Presley, Chris Christopherson, and an ad for Gerber. Look at that old jar. There's the crossword puzzle. And an ad for Coffee Amaretto by LaRue. And that covers the magazine. So that was a pretty long video. And I hope you enjoyed it. So, gave you a few things to look up if you're interested in some 80s history. And until next time, I hope you enjoyed the video. And please rate, comment, and subscribe.